And there's more. We have only been considering the real world translated into numbers, but let's now have a look at the other way around. Numbers translated into the real world. A series of numbers, if there are no set limits, goes from 0 to infinity. There are also negative numbers and imaginary numbers, but that's outside the scope of what we are looking at here. Going back to our original 100 squares, the number of possible patterns would range from all the squares being blank to all the squares being filled in. Write down a series of random numbers separated by commas to indicate whether on the x or y axis, and then fill in the squares that these numbers represent. You will most likely get a series of squares dotted anywhere, which don't look like anything in particular. Keep at it, and purely by chance you will eventually produce something which looks like an object in the real world. Scale this idea up to the whole universe, and the universe where we live now is represented by one admittedly very large number. The vast majority of these very large but random numbers, when translated into terms of an actual universe, would be just random clouds of gas without any structure whatsoever. The nice thing about this concept, though, is that just occasionally these random numbers would produce a real universe, but not like ours. This would be a completely different, parallel universe. Following this line of thought, it follows that every possible universe would be within this universal data bank of numbers. But that does not mean that they would all exist in the real material universe. Just for a bit of fun, and to make the point that random numbers can sometimes be related to real things, set Google search at images and type in any random number of, say, 6 or 7 digits and see what comes up on your screen. And there's more yet. You may have noticed that so far I have used the expression almost infinite. There is a reason. So far I have not discussed time. Time is regarded as the fourth dimension, but we cannot add it to our diagram as such. It just wouldn't work. Also, time has properties that the first 3 dimensions don't. We can move about freely in the first 3, but not in time. In the previous examples, the universe was complete, but only for one moment in time, a snapshot as it were. To picture the universe as it really is, including time, would need a snapshot of every moment from beginning to end. But since we already have those snapshots on our universal data bank, as it were, generated numerically, then it is simply a matter of viewing pre-existing snapshots one after another. This is precisely how the old cinema films worked, which was a reel of still photographs, each one slightly different from the ones before and after, which when projected at speed gave the impression of real movement in time. To explain this using our 100 square grid, imagine a little figure drawn from just a few squares moving from left to right across the grid. The total number of patterns possible on the grid is a fixed number, although extremely large. This number is actually 1.26765 times 10 to the power of 30, derived from the formula 2 to the power of n2 from the 2 possible states of each square, and n from the number of squares. To put this into perspective, for those who do not have a mathematical turn of mind, a simple grid of 5 by 5 giving a total number of squares of 25 would have a possible number of combinations of over 33 million. It is just a matter of selecting the right patterns, the snapshots, in the right order, and then viewing them quickly to give the impression the little figure is moving. This, in fact, would be a very simple form of animation. The order in which this is done we shall call the timeline of the little figure. Now suppose the little figure moves from the bottom to the top. a different timeline. The same principle applies, but with one very important point to be made. In the middle of its journey, it will pass the path taken by the figure moving across the grid. At this point, and at this point only, both snapshots will be the same one. I am going ahead of myself a little here, but this could possibly be an explanation for some of the strange and weird situations we encounter in life. It could be that there is some element in our lives in which our timeline crosses another, and from the past, present or future, which causes us to have the feeling that this has happened before, or other strange experiences. To return to the main line of thought. So what determines the next snapshot? In the case of this exercise, it is us. We are acting as God to the little figure. But in the real world, what decides the next moment in time, or snapshot, where we take the place of the little figure? If God controls our every action, then it is God, and we become mere puppets, or like the characters in an animation film, merely products of the artist's imagination. But I do not believe this to be the case, because everything in the universe has momentum, and all living things with a mind have a will. It is this which decides what the next snapshot or the future will be like. Do not misunderstand me in this. It is only a metaphor. The real world is far more complicated. I have just scaled up from a very simple idea to a much larger one, but the principle is the same. I will now discuss the timeline, which raises many possibilities but also some problems. Basically, the timeline would start at the Big Bang, work its way through billions upon billions of snapshots until it gets to the end, if there is one. As we discussed earlier, most of the snapshots would be random, either random patterns of clouds of dust, and as such would not be included in our timeline, but would still be included in the universal data bank, the mind of God. We can look back on our own timeline through history and science and see that it all makes sense, but we do not know how it has actually got started. Who lit the touch paper at the Big Bang? I can think of no answer using this metaphor, just as science does not have a definitive answer with the real universe. To return to our old reel of film, we can examine every shot in detail, right back to the very first, but we do not know how or why the film projector got switched on. A further possibility is that there may be more than one timeline, each one moving forward under its own momentum and will, but taking a different path to our own, using a different set of snapshots and so producing a different but parallel universe. All of this, of course, would still be within the mind of the same God. To put this in a way suitable for explanation to a small child, think of two railway trains leaving London at the same time. One heads up the west coast line and the other up the east coast line. The people on the train are seeing two different parts of the countryside, but they are still in the same country and heading in the same general direction. The trains have their own momentum and power, moving them on. They are just going on different tracks, and of course there is all the rest of the country that neither train passes. I feel at this point I should apologise to any physicist who may have stumbled across this work and be thinking what a load of rubbish it all is. Firstly, it is a metaphor, a mental exercise to try to explain something of the purpose of the mind of God in the real universe, and that within that mind is far more than is or even will be included in any real universe. Secondly, I am an engineer by profession, and so my explanations are purely Newtonian. It is not that I am unaware of relativity or quantum physics, it is just that it would be far more complicated to include them in a rather simple and condensed work such as this. There is a further point of a philosophical nature which I will try to explain, but to which I cannot give a definitive answer one way or the other. It is often said that time itself is an illusion, that there is in reality no such thing as the past, present or future. It is only our consciousness which moves forward from the past into the future. The present is simply what we, as individuals, see as the present. This can be a scientific viewpoint as well as a philosophical and religious one. St. Augustine famously said that time was made for mankind, not for God, who is timeless. The timeline, if this is true, rather than being one for each universe, would be one for each conscious mind. Whether for the collective mind of humanity or for each individual would be pure speculation, but since the timeline would not be anchored in the material universe, it raises the possibility of a real immortality of the mind. J.W. Dunne did much research on this subject, and his book, An Experiment with Time, gives details of his experiments and his conclusions. Finally, let me conclude this section with the observation that I hope this work gives the reader some idea of the immensity of the mind of God, far larger than the universe, but not the whole picture by any means. The human mind is not capable of knowing the whole nature of God, and never will be. So if anyone says to you that this is not God, what they should say is that this is not the whole of God, and they would be right. It is a non-personal idea of God, based on mathematics and science. There are, though, a great many people who refer to God in personal terms, such as the God of love, of peace, or mercy. I will leave it to them to explain this aspect. It is not within my own experiences, and so could not do it justice.